What's to like about an unlikable narrator? Hooray for the anti-hero. How to love a narrator who doesn't love herself. Cass Neary's questionable life decisions. What's the deal with characters photographing dead people? How to love the jerk in your life. Some of us find jerks charming. Is she a jerk or is she just sad? Unlikable narrators or anti-heroes play an important role in a lot of fiction, and I just finished one great literary thriller that features an incredibly unlikable but somehow still lovable anti-hero, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to talk about how an unlikable narrator functions in a piece of fiction, why an author might choose to make use of an unlikable narrator or a narrator who makes very questionable choices throughout the novel that are somehow alienating to the reader, and why you might want to do the same. If you're a writer yourself, why you might want to consider adding some unlikability to your own narrator. So Cass Neary has had it pretty rough. She is the protagonist of this literary thriller. It's the first in a series featuring Cass Neary as the narrator and protagonist by Elizabeth Hand, and it was published originally in 2007, but it was reissued by Small Beer Press in 2020. And Cass is dealing with some serious trauma in multiple forms from multiple sources, both from her childhood and from her adult life. She is a photographer, or a former photographer, who encountered a bit of fame in her 20s, photographing the punk rock scene in New York City in the late 1970s. Really, she was just a flash in the pan. She had one book of her photographs that made her famous for a moment, and her biggest claim to fame is that she photographed young people who had experienced an overdose, including some who she in fact found dead. Yes, you heard that right. She photographed dead people, but that was 20 years ago. She pretty much hasn't taken a photograph since. She is kind of scrounging to put together a life. She's working in the stockroom at the Strand, which is a very famous bookstore in New York, and her life is pretty consumed by drugs and alcohol. She doesn't have many relationships. She's sabotaged a lot of relationships. She's pretty much just floundering until one day she gets a call from a friend or an acquaintance who says he has a job for her. There is a famous photographer named Aphrodite who lives on a remote island in Maine, and she has requested an interview, and she specifically requested that Cass Neary be the one to come up to Maine to interview her. And this woman, Aphrodite, is famously reclusive. She also had several famous photography books back in the day and hasn't been doing much since. And so Cass jumps at the opportunity to go up to Maine and interview and take photographs of this woman, who turns out was actually an inspiration for Cass and kind of a legend, and someone who Cass had looked up to as a bit of a muse for her own work. And so Cass jumps at the opportunity and heads up to Maine, only to find maybe she wasn't quite as expected there as she was led to believe. And so she kind of gets stuck there. Well, she makes herself stuck a little bit, and discovers that there indeed are some mysterious and perhaps deadly things going on the island. And this book is really dark and lush. The author lived in Maine for many decades, and you can definitely tell by the descriptions of both the landscape and the people. The people lead pretty harsh, hard lives. The landscape is harsh and hard. The water is treacherous. There are beautiful pine forests, but also scary animals lurking in every tree. And one of the islands has a really cool abandoned granite an old granite quarry with all sorts of cool sculptures and things like that. It's beautiful and harsh. It's frightening and dangerous, cold, but really alluring, both to you as you're reading it, but also to Cass as she's encountering it for the first time as an outsider. So the world really, really draws you in, just as it's drawing Cass in. And the title, Generation Loss, is a photography term that's a little gem that you find out early on in the book, so I'm not going to spoil that here because it's fun to discover that as you're reading. Cass's decisions throughout the book are highly questionable. She is, to me, kind of the perfect unlikable narrator. I happen to like unlikable narrators, as I think a lot of us do, especially when you're reading noir, like the noir genre. It's fun to have an unlikable narrator, and you kind of need it. So I thought I would just explore a little bit why we need Cass to make such unlikable and alienating decisions in order for the book to work as a whole, and then maybe why we're drawn to such unlikable people as our narrators in these dark thrillers. I always think it's helpful to examine like specific examples within a book to understand a broader narrative choice. It's just fun to pick apart a novel and see how it works. So here's how I think Elizabeth Hand makes Cass Neary so very unlikable. This is told in first person, and personally I think that actually makes you as a reader more likely to root for the narrator, because you're kind of going along a journey with them and they're speaking directly to you. So I think that the author made some very deliberate choices in order to make sure that we are we're kind of rooting for Cass, but also we're questioning what the heck she's doing. Cass is not very kind to others. She sabotages a lot of her relationships. Kind of a snob about artsy things, which is a little alienating, and at least for me. She makes a lot of hard to understand decisions, especially in her interactions with other people. There's this one incident where she does something very cruel and inexplicable to a complete stranger. And it's not really, there's never a reason given why, she just does it. She just plays this cruel trick for no apparent reason. She also makes a lot of questionable decisions about how she's treating her own body. She takes lots and lots and lots of drugs, drinks lots and lots and extreme amounts of alcohol just to function through the day. And those are really methods of disengaging with the world. It's like actually putting on a mask that works both ways. When she's under the influence of drugs and alcohol, we can't see clearly into her, and she also is masking the outside world to herself. She can't see clearly out. And so that kind of breaks the connection between us and Cass. There's also a lot of insider language specifically about photography and the art world. And I found that personally really alienating because I'm not familiar with that jargon. And so that's just another way of pushing others away by using jargon and technical terms that other people aren't going to understand and going really in depth with them. And those insider details are a great way for someone to distance themselves from others. Just one more thing that we don't have in common. So those are all behaviors that Cass is using to push away other people, and in the process she's kind of pushing us as readers away as well. And perhaps the most distancing of all of the behaviors is that she photographs dead people. She encounters someone who is deceased and she doesn't call for help, she doesn't check for a pulse, she doesn't even necessarily know if they're dead or at what point they have died. She just starts taking photographs. In her 20s, the book that she published is called Dead Girls. And for me, that is one of the most unlikable and characteristics that is hardest for me to understand about Cass and connect with her on. Cass may be unlikable, but she's not unsympathetic. We still end up feeling a lot of compassion for her choices. And I think there are some big choices that Elizabeth Hand makes to make sure that we do feel compassion for Cass, that we are rooting for her in the end, and that we kind of, despite her being unlikable, kind of still really like her. And I think one of the biggest, most impactful choices is that the book actually starts with Cass as a young girl. And I think it's hard to see someone as a child and not then feel compassion for them as an adult. It's really hard to avoid feeling some tenderness for someone when you see what's happened to them as a child, or even just see them as a child depicted on the page. I think that was a huge, important choice that the author made. We also see, through flashbacks throughout the novel, we get to learn and see a lot of the trauma that Cass has been through, and therefore that adds nuance to the questionable decisions that Cass is making. And so in the end, we do see Cass as a complex character and not just as a jerk. And like I said, this is told in first person, and I think it's hard not to root for someone who's talking directly to you and who is confiding in you. I think that makes us feel good to have someone talking to us and confiding in us. And so it's hard not to root for Cass in the end. Quick plug for Small Beer Press. I'm having a Small Beer Press August. I'm reading books all from Small Beer Press this month. Small Beer Press is a small independent publisher based in Massachusetts, and they publish literary fiction and a lot of fantasy too. And they tend to publish a lot of reissued books from authors that maybe don't have quite as wide a following as they should, including Elizabeth Hand and this Cass Neary series. And it's founded by Gavin Grant and Kelly Link. And Kelly Link is one of my favorite short story authors, and so it just makes sense that I'm kind of drawn to the books that they publish as well. And small beer, so my husband tells me that a small beer refers to a beer that has only a little amount of alcohol. And it is a British term also that refers to something that is trivial or not important. And so I think, as I mentioned before, I think this is a tongue-in-cheek reference in naming their publisher, maybe naming their press Small Beer Press. Quick interlude for a veggie haul, this week's veggie haul from our CSA from Nichols Farm. I had a little helper out on the back porch helping me unbox our veggies for the week, so please enjoy the vegetables.
Okay, so what do we have here? Oh, it's a big bag of lettuce. Crazy.
Cabbage.
Then we have something I don't like. Oh, it's a beautiful color.
Oh, eggplant, my favorite.
Okay, yeah.
What's that? That looks like green beans. Yes, my favorite. Shishito peppers.
Oh, Mommy. Oh, potatoes.
Oh, thank goodness. I love potatoes.
Potatoes. We're saved.
Oh, we're saved. More corn.
So that's pretty good.
That's
And
very
these are all together. I didn't even know there was another one of these pickles. And this is all.
That's the haul. Gorgeous.
All the cover aroma.
So we've kind of answered how Elizabeth Hand uses an unlikable narrator in Cass Neary in Generation Loss. But I also started thinking about why it was so important for Cass to be so unlikable and such an anti-hero in this book, and in general how unlikable narrators serve fiction in all sorts of different books. So especially in noir fiction, a novel often needs a protagonist who will go places that other people might not go, both physically go to places that other people would not want to go to, but also emotionally and mentally go to a place that other people just won't go. Kind of like you need to be closest to madness in order to look at madness in the eye and not flinch. And I think that's a lot of what is going on in this novel with Cass. She literally goes where no one else will go, and she looks madness straight in the eye and doesn't flinch. And we need her to do that in order to get to the end of the book. So Cass needs to do certain very unlikable things as plot points to get to the end of the book. So she drugs people, she breaks into places she's not supposed to go, she goes through people's personal things, she steals things, and all of those things get us one step closer to the end and one step closer to Cass encountering kind of the evil that is lurking in the background of this novel. So she needs to do unlikable things in order to even get to the point to even get to the climax of the book. And maybe she's actually the only one who's damaged enough to pursue this lurking, I say evil, but because I don't want to give away like what the core mystery is of the novel, but she's the only one damaged enough to pursue the villain, I guess. There's kind of a sense of a kindred spirit between her and this darkness that is lurking out there in this community on this remote island in Maine. They're similar enough in order to be able to see each other even before they even have met. They can see and understand signals from each other. And Cass is the only one who's really able to recognize these signs of damage within this community because she's so close to that damage herself within her own mind. Cass's unlikability also adds a lot to the tension because she becomes almost like a suspect in some of these mysterious happenings on the island. I even found myself suspecting Cass and wondering, okay, well, what is she actually capable of doing? And that really heightens the tension of the novel when your narrator that you're kind of rooting for becomes a suspect. That adds tension and momentum. And also adding momentum is the question of like, well, what jerky thing is she gonna do next? Because the novel is kind of a slow burn in the beginning, and that's something that really kept me reading throughout it, was like, okay, well, what mean thing is she going to do next to the next person? But it makes me wonder, why are we drawn to narrators like this beyond the voyeuristic appeal and curiosity of witnessing intense damage in another person's life? I think it tells us something about ourselves, and it adds to the frightening experience of a thriller to see how close anyone can be to losing control, to seeing how certain choices could be made or certain accidents could happen that you have no control over, that will lead you down a path of absolutely no control. You completely lose yourself and you completely lose direction, and you get closer and closer and closer to that darkness. And what's so interesting about Cass is that she has lost control, she has lost direction, she is completely floundering and is using substances to cope with the everyday. She has one thing in her life that helps her maintain control, and that's photography. Photography for Cass is all about control, and specifically about control of trauma and of death. By photographing trauma and death, she in turn is controlling it. She is stopping it in its tracks. It's a method of conquering that trauma and conquering that death and putting it in its place. And I could feel a lot of parallels between writing and photography. It dawned on me that there maybe isn't much difference between writing about death and photographing death. Writing about dead people, how is that different than photographing dead people? That's one of my favorite things in fiction, is when art forms are kind of put in parallel to each other, like writing about an artist kind of makes you think about how those two art forms work in similar ways. So both writing and Cass's photography turn to darkness to convey a certain vision, a certain way of seeing the world. And taking death as a subject within both photography and writing could be seen as a way of attempting to control it. Both are putting death down on paper, stopping it in its tracks. And you can't have an optimistic or happy-go-lucky narrator conveying that message. So you need someone like Cass Neary, who has that damage, to use her own words, in order to see that darkness within the world and within herself and within all of us. To see how close all of us could be to losing control, losing complete control. You need someone who's close to that darkness, who embodies it. And that is what sends chills down my spine when I'm reading a thriller like Generation Loss. Elizabeth Hand has written nearly 20 novels and several collections of short fiction. She writes fantasy and crime noir thrillers. Like I said, there are several books in the Cass Neary series, at least 3 of which I believe are published by Small Beer Press. She's won a ton of awards, and interestingly, she said in interviews that she often writes about artists, which I think is really cool. Again, like I said, I love reading fiction about artists because I love that parallel between art forms and exploring the parallels. And she lived the New York City punk scene in the 1970s, which is why those flashbacks from Cass Neary's perspective feel so well drawn. And Elizabeth Hand has said in interviews that she's had her own experiences with trauma and kind of losing direction, and she has claimed that Cass Neary is kind of a vision of herself if she had continued to lose control, kind of off the rails through her life. So it was kind of therapeutic to create this Cass Neary character as, maybe an alternate version or a version that could have been. So who is this book for? If you like a gritty literary thriller, I think you'll really love this book. I saw one comparison to Patricia Highsmith. It's popped up on several lists. One of them was hipster mysteries, a list on the website Crime Reads came up with a list of hipster mysteries. So I don't fully understand what that means, but I think the reference to the gritty punk rock New York scene is what got this on that hipster mystery list. There's also apparently a list of books that adult fans of Veronica Mars will like, and the Cass Neary books made it onto that list as well. I think there's also a huge appeal among readers like me of books of dark fiction set in Maine. And so if you are a fan of dark fiction set in Maine, you will definitely like this book. Follow-up reading to this book, I think, has to be the rest of the Cass Neary series. I'm not really sure where else I could recommend going from there. That's where I'm gonna go next. I'll be back soon with more books from Small Beer Press, and right now I think I'm gonna go read a book, and I hope you do something similarly fun. Bye.